Hey guys, Josh here from the Pop Culture Cosmos coming at you with the very first edition of Pop Culture Cosmos Reviews. And our first review is the latest entry in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, Thor Ragnarok. For anybody familiar with the cosmic side of the Marvel Comics universe, you're no doubt aware that Thor hasn't exactly been done justice when it comes to his solo outings on the big screen. As the fourth film to come out in Phase 1 of Marvel's cinematic universe, Thor pulled in a number just north of $181 million, placing it just above the Incredible Hulk, which earned just shy of $135 million, and nowhere near Iron Man and Iron Man 2, which both earned over $300 million. And while its 2013 sequel, Thor: The Dark World, did slightly better, bringing a little over $206 million in, it still wasn't exactly a favorite among fans, only garnering a 66% on Rotten Tomatoes despite being certified fresh. But let's be honest, even though Thor: The Dark World might not have been Marvel's greatest big screen outing, it was still pretty darn good. When it was announced back in 2016 that director Taika Waititi would be directing Thor Ragnarok, fans of everyone's favorite Asgardians saw this as an opportunity to right Marvel Studios' past mistakes. After all, with that unique brand of humor that Chris Hemsworth is able to channel through Thor and the writing and directing talents of a man whose works include Boy, Hunt for the Wilder People, and the critically acclaimed What We Do in the Shadows, the potential seemed limitless. And while previous directors in the franchise, Kenneth Branagh and Alan Taylor, both brought something different to the films using Dutch angles, special effects, and drastic shifts in setting and tone, the bigwigs over at Marvel Studios recruited Taika Waititi to bring out something in Thor that we've only seen glimpses of throughout his time in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. And that thing would be humor. Did it pay off? That's kind of the question, isn't it? Thor Ragnarok hasn't even made it to the end of its opening weekend and has not only earned over $200 million worldwide so far, it's also been a hit with critics being certified fresh on Rotten Tomatoes with a 93%, and some are even calling it the best Marvel film yet. So you guys all know how I feel about critic culture. So let's find out what the critics are saying. The Hollywood Reporter's Sherry Linden said Waititi's interest in intimate stories was evident in Hunt for the Wilder People, but it's the knack for dry comedy that he brought to the mockumentary What We Do in the Shadows that shapes the new Thor. Over at Polygon, Brock Wilbur's inner fanboy was evident when he said Ragnarok is the child of confident filmmaking and understanding of what the Thor franchise could have always been. He went on to say that the movie sets the standard by which the entire MCU will have to adhere to, including the upcoming Avengers Infinity War. Ragnarok is an intense space opera that genuinely cares about every character having a journey and doesn't waste a second of screen time on anything artificial. Even the folks over at Empire liked it. Film reviewer James Dyer said, like a cosmic fever dream, Ragnarok is a disorienting cocktail of riotous color and batty antics that seem almost unreal after the fact. Try to fit it into an established mold at your own peril, but roll with this and you'll discover not only a top-tier addition to the MCU, but one of the most flat-out enjoyable comedies of the year. So, yeah, it would seem that Thor Ragnarok has been doing pretty well among critics. However, like I mentioned earlier, if you've read any of the reviews on this site, you might know that we're not exactly huge fans of critic culture. We also don't always agree with each other, especially when it comes to the Marvel Cinematic Universe and Thor's place in it. Just ask Gerald about that. That being said, please don't listen to this review and think that it's biased towards one view or another. Also be aware that if you listen past this point, we're going to get down to the bones of this review and you will be hit with a lot of spoilers. Marvel has been having quite a few problems lately when it comes to what movies take place where on their timeline. If you'll recall the Spider-Man fiasco, which they just recently remedied. Thor Ragnarok begins somewhere in the aftermath of Avengers, Age of Ultron, and Doctor Strange, and for the most part appears to run alongside Captain America's Civil War and Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2. When we first join our hero, we find out via a story being told to a skeleton that he's been all over the cosmos chasing Infinity Stones while simultaneously trying to stop the prophecies of Ragnarok. And for those of you familiar with Norse mythology, it's basically the Norse version of the end times. According to legend, Surtur the fire demon is destined to destroy Asgard and bring about the end of the world as we know it. Naturally, Thor puts an end to him by knocking his head off and barely escaping thanks to the idiocy of the new guardian of the Rainbow Bridge, Scourge, which is played by Karl Urban, whom you may or may not know as Scourge the Executioner, who's less a scary villain he is in the comic books and more of a bumbling idiot. Once back in Asgard, Thor makes a startling discovery that things aren't what they seem or the way he left them, after finding Odin dressed in his bathrobes and watching a play that's reenacting the death of Loki, in which director Waititi takes a few shots of the dark tone of Thor, the Dark Underworld. After Thor discovers Loki has been impersonating his father, and with a little intimidation, the two of them set off to Midgard to recover their king. Remember, Midgard is Earth, for those of you who aren't familiar with that term. The only problem is the retirement home where Loki left Odin is being demolished by bulldozers. As the two of them stand there arguing, a familiar ring of spinning sparks show up and Loki disappears. This is where things pick up from the after-credits scene of Doctor Strange. If you'll recall, in the end of Doctor Strange, it shows Thor sitting in front of him drinking a beer. So basically, Doctor Strange is worried about Loki's presence on Earth. He makes a deal with Thor that he'll help them find Odin if they leave immediately afterwards. When the two of them finally do catch up to their father, they find him in his final moments on some cliffs in Norway, where he explains to them that they have a megalomaniac for a sister named Hela, who is not only the goddess of death and far more powerful than the two of them, but is also imprisoned and only being held wherever she is by Odin's life force. So naturally, Odin dies in the next scene. After Thor and Loki refuse to bend the knee to Hela, she destroys Thor's trusted hammer, Mjolnir, scaring Loki into opening the Rainbow Bridge. And as the three of them are fighting and traveling through space and time, both Thor and Loki are tossed out into the cosmos, leaving Hela free to terrorize and enslave Asgard. After a brutal scene depicting Hela killing the Warriors 3 and laying waste to Asgard's army, we rejoin Thor and Loki, who have somehow ended up on planet Sakaar, which is where both Planet Hulk and Skaar, the Son of Hulk comic books take place. And wouldn't you know it, it's also where the Hulk ended up after the events of Avengers Age of Ultron. The only problem is that the Hulk has been the Hulk for 2 entire years, and when Bruce Banner finally reemerges, he warns Thor that the Hulk has been in control for so long that if he turns into Hulk again, Bruce Banner might not ever come back. However, I'm getting ahead of myself. While Loki has managed to talk his way into favor with the Grand Master, Thor has been kidnapped by Valkyrie, an Asgardian who was once part of Asgard's famed Valkyrie warriors, who were all allegedly wiped out by Hela. Valkyrie sells Thor to the Grand Master, who sends him to the Tournament of Champions to fight a ferocious creature that is thus far undefeated. And as it turns out, that ferocious creature is actually the Hulk. Long story short, Thor, with the help of Valkyrie, Loki, and Korg, a blue rock creature played by Taika Waititi, escape. They end up back on Asgard, where Heimdall has been making life difficult for Hela. There's an epic showdown where villains redeem themselves, heroes discover their true power, and a bunch of escaped slaves from Sakaar make a real mess of things. There's also a showdown between the Hulk and a giant wolf. In the end, Thor realizes that the only way to save Asgard and defeat Hela is to let Asgard be destroyed, meaning he has to let Ragnarok run its course. Fortunately, in the MCU, Ragnarok only means the end of Asgard and not the universe, at least as far as we know. Perhaps as a story for Thor 4, assuming he lives through Avengers Infinity War. And speaking of Avengers Infinity War, if you stay for the first after-credit scene, you'll find that Thor Ragnarok feeds directly into the next Avengers film by having the ship they used to escape Asgard run into Sanctuary 2, which, if you're a comic book fan, you'll recognize as the ship that Thanos gets around in. All right, time for the good, the bad, and the verdict. As far as redeeming the Thor franchise goes, I'm among the few who never thought Thor needed redeeming. Granted, his first film was pretty to look at, but it was rather bland, and all the Dutch angles used by Kenneth Branagh were a little much. However, of all the criticism the film continuously receives, you never hear anyone say it was boring. As for Thor Ragnarok, the film builds upon both Thor and Thor the Dark World by taking us to new realms and upping the ante considerably in terms of what's at stake. The fight scenes are also massive and full of destruction. To give you something to compare it to, think about the brawl between Thor and Malekith in Thor the Dark World, and then amplify it by about 100. Thor Ragnarok has more action scenes than both of its predecessors combined. I would even go as far as to put it on par with Joss Whedon's Avenger films. Then there's the acting. Director Taika Waititi did an excellent job in both keeping the tone of the film lighter than the others and also timing the laughs so they don't feel forced or overdone like they were in Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2. And there's never a moment when his character Korg wasn't welcome on screen. His dry humor helped pace the film, keeping you intrigued and laughing but not distracting you from what was happening. Then there's Chris Hemsworth, who gets a lot of heat from fans for taking an almost too Shakespearean approach to Thor. He had some funny moments in his solo outings, but it was Joss Whedon who showed us his potential to be funny in both Avengers and Avengers Age of Ultron. In fact, I would even go as far as to say that this film exists because of the on-screen antics between Thor and the Hulk in Avengers. It's also good to see that Marvel finally made use of the formidable acting chops of Idris Elba. If there's one mistake that is more than apparent in the first two Thor films, it's the gross underuse of one of the franchise's most talented actors. Yes, he did see a little more screen time in Thor: The Dark World, but in this movie he was not only given a chance to take center stage, he sort of helped keep the movie held together, which is something it desperately needed with a continuous shift between worlds that are completely different to each other. Speaking of worlds, what a great time to be alive. We're in the midst of a Jeff Goldblum renaissance. First, we got to see him reprise his role in the not-so-well-received Independence Day resurgence. Then we got to see him do his thing in Thor Ragnarok, and next year we'll get to see him in the currently unnamed Jurassic Park sequel. Watching him play the Grand Master under the direction of Taika Waititi was almost magical. Other good things worth mentioning are the way that they were able to give us a Thor sequel and sort of give us a Hulk sequel without actually giving the Hulk his own film. We can thank Universal for that, or Marvel, I guess, depending on where you stand on their decision making. They also did a great job of making Thor Ragnarok stand on its own. With the exception of the storyline involving the Hulk and the Quinjet, there weren't many tie-ins to other characters in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. And how could I forget about Jane Foster? It was nice to finally get a movie that wasn't filled with her whining, which is also the first thing on the bad part of this review. Alright, so for the bad, the romance between Jane Foster and Thor has always felt very cardboard and uninteresting. But after ending Thor: The Dark World in a place that seemed to speak good things about their future, burying their relationship with only a few quickly spoken sentences felt insulting and made a good portion of the previous films feel like a complete waste of time. Don't get me wrong, I was never a huge fan of Natalie Portman, but the role of Jane Foster has always been an important one in the many story arcs that make up Thor's comic books. Kate Blanchett's Hela is another character that didn't exactly get their due. In the comic books, Hela is actually the daughter of Loki, but seeing how Loki's been more focused on ruling the 9 realms through nefarious means than he has been on making babies, I can see why they chose to make Hela Odin's daughter instead. While Kate Blanchett did an excellent job of playing the part and is building quite the portfolio of parts adored by nerds, she wasn't exactly given a chance to shine. Though I understand that the movie was busy, and with a running time of over 2 hours, it's hard to give everyone their due, but there's still so much about Hela that I would have liked to see brought to life. For example, what was her motivation? Was she simply far too ambitious, or was she striving for her father's favor? What pushed her over the edge? There's also the fact that her father, for what might have been thousands of years, imprisoned her in a place that didn't sound very pleasant to be. That's definitely enough to give somebody daddy issues. Unfortunately, we didn't really get to see Hela's character develop past the point of her killing people and throwing swords everywhere. She was basically so strong you could see there were times in the script where the writers didn't know what to do with her. Speaking of Hela killing people and characters who didn't get justice, what was up with the minimal amount of screen time given to the Warriors 3? Their deaths weren't even scripted that well. Volstagg and Fandral were hanging out on the Rainbow Bridge for what appeared to be no reason, and only one of them got to say anything before dying. As for Hogan, who has always been the most tolerable of the Warriors, at least he got to put up a fight before he died. Then there's Lady Sif, who's played by Jamie Alexander. She's a busy woman, and fortunately, she got to miss out on dying. Again, after spending parts of the 2 previous films developing these characters, seeing them die so quickly and with such a lack of screen time makes portions of the last 2 films feel like a complete waste of time. Now let's talk about the comedy aspect. Don't take this the wrong way, I love the humor in Thor Ragnarok, and unlike Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2, the jokes weren't gratuitous. However, there were parts in the movie when it felt like they sacrificed depth and character development for cheap laughs. I mentioned this on the Pop Culture Cosmos Multiverse podcast earlier this week. Thor has a lot of potential. For lack of a better word, he's an epic character. He just needs to have his story portrayed in a way that properly depicts the size and scope of the world in which he lives. Director Taika Waititi did a good job with giving the film volume in terms of size and scope, but it was all very surface level, making it feel like the epic aspects were purposely replaced with action scenes and one-liners, sort of like a Ron Perlman movie. This is something that Marvel films continuously suffer from, and audiences don't really help with it. After all, why give a film a good story with depth and layers when you can fill it with explosions and campy dialogue? This is why Ant-Man is never put into any top 10 list among MCU, because it actually has depth to it. As for the verdict, it's good to see Thor and Loki getting along, though how long that lasts remains to be seen. They certainly left his gaze lingering on the Tesseract for a forebodingly long amount of time. And if you watch the first end credit scene, It sets it up perfect for Loki to deliver the Tesseract/Space Stone to Thanos, whether on purpose or by force. Overall, Thor Ragnarok ended in the perfect place for Avengers Infinity War to begin. Whether or not the Black Panther will have any sort of build-up to the next Avengers film is all speculation at this point. As for now, director Taika Waititi has taken our favorite Asgardian Avenger to places we never thought we'd see him go when he first appeared on the big screen back in 2011. Thor Ragnarok might not have the serious tone we've come to expect from Thor films, but it might be the most entertaining movie in Phase 3, and possibly the Marvel Cinematic Universe as a whole. While his fate remains to be seen in Avengers Infinity War, it'd be nice to see him get another solo outing. It's just a shame it's taken them this long to make his character so likable with the fans. If you can't wait to see what happens next, fear not, Marvel has closed the gap significantly in their release schedule. Black Panther is set to come out on February 16th, and Avengers Infinity War is due to come out on April 25th. As for now, Thor Ragnarok has something for every Marvel fan and is well worth paying the increasing cost of movie tickets to see. If you like this review, please follow us on Facebook and be sure to tune in to the Pop Culture Cosmos show every Monday night on the Podcast Radio Network and the Pop Culture Cosmos Multiverse show every Wednesday night on the Podcast Radio Network. And you can also check us out on iTunes. And we have a website at popculturecosmos.wordpress.com. Thanks for tuning in.